Just to conclude the discussion that I've had with you regarding kashrus, so I wanted to discuss with you tonight certain ideas regarding shchita, really historic ideas. And the Torah doesn't say how to kill an animal. The Torah just assumes that we're going to know how. So basically, it's all tradition. Aloch l'Moshe Sinai, Gemara and Chum, and the basis is that fish and insects do not require any specific form. You take the fish out of the water, and that'll do it. And insects as well, grasshoppers, but that ophos and behemoths require a form called shchita. So by the form requires that in the neck of the creature, the windpipe, the kone, or the trachea, and the veshet, the esophagus, be severed by a very sharp knife, and they should be cut with a forward and backwards motion. And then we have all sorts of halachas regarding what constitutes a kosher shchita or not. You cannot press too hard. The knife has to always be visible. You can't delay in the middle, but it has to be one continuous motion. The Gemara discusses all of this, and that's the basis that we have shchita today. Now, in the Beis HaMikdash, when the Kohanim performed shchita for the korbanot, so there were rings in the floor of the Beit HaMikdash, and each family of the Kohanim had its own specific ring built into the floor, and then the animal's head, so to speak, was forced through this ring, which held it down on the floor, and the Kohen then was able to shech the animal, cut the esophagus and the trachea. So that's called shchita munachas. The animal is lying on the floor. So that used to be the case. Sometimes it's pretty, if you don't have the ability, it's hard to wrestle a 1,300-pound steer to the floor when he doesn't want to go. But shchita throughout the ages was pretty much a local thing. It was not an industrialized thing, as it is today. I know my father-in-law told me that in his town, they shechted one behemoth a week. They shechted it on Wednesday. And then they looked over the animal. All the animals in Europe had shilas to them. They all were not perfect. And then they stayed up all night making it kosher. And Thursday there was meat, so the women could start to prepare for Shabbat. But that's one animal a week, which is not the case that exists today. In the 19th century, in the United States, they developed industrialized the slaughter of animals. In Chicago was famous for it, the packing houses, where you could kill, and they kill 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 animals a day. And so originally that was also very labor intensive. But they made an assembly line in which they cut up the pieces and took out all the. It's a very gory business. And when we get the food on the table, so we don't realize what happened beforehand. And maybe that's very good because then we wouldn't eat it with such gusto. In any event, so in the United States, the kosher slaughterhouses, and this was a point that has to be made, the kosher slaughterhouses were really in the business of selling non-kosher. What do I mean by that? Half the animal, because in the Gola they don't take the gid anoshe, it's too labor intensive to take out that gid anoshe, and there's less than 30% of the meat left after you're done. So it just doesn't pay. So that half of the animal was automatically sold on the non-kosher market. So you have a kosher slaughterhouse, half of every animal has to be sold on the non-kosher market. On the non-kosher market, it brings a very small price because you are in competition. Let's say the kosher slaughterhouses in the United States killed 350 to 400 animals a day. But you had Iowa boxed beef, for instance, that killed 3,500 animals a day. And they killed them with the same amount of people that we were killing 350. So therefore, the price of meat, and they're selling to McDonald's and to all the big chains. So the price of non-kosher meat was always relatively inexpensive. So the kosher slaughterer had to sell half of his product for cheaper than it cost him to produce it. Then you'll add to it that on the other half, the kosher half, 4 quarters, etc., you have a percentage that is non-kosher, that's treif. Has problems with the lungs, there are problems in the stomach. So approximately 30% or even as high as 35% of the so-called kosher part also is not kosher. Also has to be sold on the non-kosher market. So how do they stay in business? The only way they stay in business is that kosher meat costs 2 and 3 times whatever non-kosher meat costs. Because that's the only way they can stay in business. And it's not because of the shochtim, and it's not because of the supervision. All of that is infinitesimal in the cost. But it's because of the marketplace. And therefore, till today, there's an imbalance in price, naturally. Here in Israel also, there's the non-kosher market here is very small, relatively speaking. So because of that, again, you're caught in an economic bind. The method for killing animals kosher in the United States until the 1970s was by a method called shackling and hoisting, in which they tied up the animal's feet and they had a pulley that pulled it up on a chain, and then the shochet went and killed the animal while it was hanging in midair. That was very dangerous because sometimes the animal fell down. Many a shochet that I knew had either had injuries from the animals. And not only that, the animal organizations always insisted that it was cruel because you're hanging it by its legs for a period of time. And generally, the anti-Semites always said that shechita was cruel. They're not cruel. but shchita was cruel. So in the United States, for instance, all the animals in the non-kosher world are first stunned, either by being hit in the head or being electrocuted before, and then they're killed. Then they're stabbed to death. But by kosher animals, we can't do that, because that creates a treifa immediately. As if you have the first volume of the Sridei Eish of Yaakov Yechiel Weinberg, who was the head of the Hildesheimer Seminary in Berlin. So in the 1930s, the first thing that the Nazis instituted, because they were interested in not being cruel to animals, and the Pasuk says, Zovchei Odom Agolim Yishokum. Those who slaughter human beings, but they kiss calves. They're always on the side of humanitarianism. So the first rule that they passed was that all animals to be slaughtered in Germany had to be electrocuted first, which meant the end of kosher shchita. So Rabbi Yechiel Weinberg wrote to all the leading rabbonim in the world whether or not there's a possibility that would not render it treifa. And what should they do under those circumstances? Should they put the electricity in the brain of the animal or not? And so the first volume of the Sridei Eish are all of the tshuvas that he got. And they are uniformly that he should not allow it, because of the fact that it renders the animal treifa in advance. So all the shchita that's done is done on an animal that is fully conscious. It's not done on a sedated animal. And that's why all of the organizations, PETA in the United States and other ones, all say that it's cruel. I remember that when I was the head of the OU, so there was a time when Switzerland considered joining the EU, becoming part of the European Union. A part of the European Union then meant that you could not ban shchita, because it was still Holocaust influenced. You couldn't ban shchita. Switzerland has banned shchita for 100 years, more than 100 years.
1893.
So, okay, that's more than 100 years. So, but Switzerland, there was a movement in Switzerland to become part of the European Union. So then they would have to allow shchita. So they sent over a committee, I remember 6 Swiss experts, to see shchita in the United States. And since I was the head of the OU, so I had to take them on a tour of all the shchita plants. Well, they never were going to approve shchita. Never. From the beginning. Before we got in the car, they weren't going to do it. But their main thing is that the animal is conscious. And therefore that's cruel. And they're against cruelty to animals because they're good people. So we therefore we developed like a pen, a cage that the animal walked into. It was not hung up anymore, but it was enclosed in the cage, and there was a bar that lifted its head, and then the shochet just walked over, and the animal could not reach him, and the shchita took place. Our research showed that all the animals were dead within 6 seconds of the time that the shochet applied the knife. And the animal dies not from the cut, it dies because it bleeds to death. That's the cause of death. And the trachea and the veshet have to be severed. And the same thing was true with poultry. And poultry is also Empire in the United States. It's not the only company anymore, but Empire does 55,000 chickens a day. And that's all industrialized. Of course, 55,000 chickens is nothing because Frank Perdue does 250,000 a day. And therefore you're competing again. But by chickens, there's very, very few incidents of trephis, less than 2%. But by big animals, by bovine, by meat, by beef, it's 30 to 35%. And so therefore all of that goes into the economics of the situation, and it goes into the industry itself. But that's the biggest improvement. There are three improvements, and this I'll end. The first improvement is that the animals today are far healthier than they've ever been. So therefore you have less problems with them. There are certain types of trephis that you never see anymore. They just don't exist anymore. They've been eliminated by antibiotics or whatever. You know, if the Green Party gets in and they get rid of all the antibiotics, I guess the trephis will come back again. But right now they're all gone. The second improvement is the knife. The knife has to be at one and the same time sharp and smooth. Well, if you make it smooth, it's not going to be sharp. And if you make it very sharp, it'll have edges that aren't smooth. So they always had a problem. The shochtim, how do you prepare the knife? How do you make it? And when they made the knives out of iron and out of bronze, those are very tough metals to make it sharp. But beginning in the 18th century, when the process of making steel came into being, and they made knives out of steel, so the Chassidim were the ones that took the new knives. They were the pioneers in it. The Misnagdim answered the Chassidish Shchita because that was not the way my father had a knife. Mm-hmm. But that became the knife. So today's knives are surgical steel. It's like a surgeon. It's unbelievable. You almost never find a problem with a knife. So that's the second great improvement. And the third improvement is in the technology itself. How the animal is treated, how it's washed, etc. So all of these outside forces have combined to make our shchita probably the best that it has ever been in the history of Jewish history, as far as kashrus is concerned. וחנניה בן הקש אומר רוצה הקדוש ברוך הוא לזכר ישראל תפיל חפים להם תורה מצוות שהם עד לא חפץ מהצדקות ירדיו תורה